Welcome to Real Estate Investing Abundance, the show for busy, fulfilled professionals like you to learn how to develop financial independence built on solid, passive real estate investments. Now, here is your host, Dr. Alan Lomax.
Hello, enlightened investors. Welcome back to Real Estate Investing Abundance. I'm your host, Dr. Alan. And as always, I'm so thankful that you are here with us today. We are going to explore a very interesting topic and one that is informative to not only me, but I'm sure to you as well. We're going to look at how we can stop lighting our money on fire. And I think all of us can benefit from that. So with us today is Andy McQuade, and he is able to, by focusing on total cost of ownership, Andy has helped add over $5 million in reoccurring annual net operating income and over $70 million in asset value for his clients. So I'm very interested to find out how Andy is able to do that. So Andy, take us into the show and share a memorable experience from your formative years that helped you to be who you are today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alan, for having me. I appreciate it. So from my formative years, I would have to say that I definitely would not be where I am now if I hadn't actually taken a summer job at a lumberyard. I was 17 years old, not even old enough to drive a forklift legally. And I was driving a forklift anyway, so that was a good time. But the guy who ran that particular store just asked me, you like to turn a wrench, you like to do this, you like to do that. My family's always been kind of in the construction / always working on houses, building houses, build and move and sell and build and move, remodel, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of grew up around construction, and, my dad was a Depression era baby. My mom was from the Depression era. I was an oops. I'm only like 44. They were 45 when they had me. So there was 20 years between me and my siblings. So I grew up with a family that was like, save everything, do as much possible as you can yourself, and blah, blah, blah. So I was in a good place to take a job at a lumberyard. I knew how to use my hands. I knew tools. I knew how to, work on cars, and I wasn't afraid to get my hands dirty and do some difficult work physically anyway. And if I hadn't taken that job, I wouldn't be doing real estate stuff right now. I would have finished college for business and probably gone to work in a cubicle somewhere and been absolutely miserable. So I learned so much in my basically first 3 to 4 years working in the real world, part-time at college and closing nights and weekends and taking more responsibility and all of that. There's definitely something to be said for the school of hard knocks and experience in life. And being able to do what I did at the age I did, I am blessed a thousandfold that I got into that company and was able to, spend 11 years there, just going through the paces and basically doing everything there was to do at a store level before I left that company and moved on to other things. So,
wow, that is fascinating, taking a job at 17 and then continuing that same job all throughout your college experience. And how many years did you say you stayed with them?
I was there for almost 11 years, about 10 and a half years.
Wow. That's interesting. Well, before we go into total cost of ownership, you said that was instrumental in leading you into real estate rather than into business. What was it really about that job that took you in that direction rather into to business school?
So they, because I was that guy who was willing to just do whatever and get my hands dirty, and I wasn't afraid to just work like a maniac, they wanted me to go full time and take a store as an assistant manager. So I dropped out of school to do that. I was making way more money than any of my friends were making at the time. We're talking, this is in the early 2000s. Actually, 2000 was when they made the phone call to me and were like, hey, we're going to have a assistant manager position. You've got it if you want it. So I was like, all right. So I withdrew from school, went full time, was full time for 3 months as an hourly associate. I actually took a pay cut to go full time hourly because I had been there closing on weekends and nights and doing part-time stuff. I was making more than the guys at the desk who were coming in, but I wasn't a manager technically. So I took the manager job, and the rest is kind of history. I did that. I ran my own store 2 years later. So I was 22 years old with my own box, general manager, total hire, fire, inventory control, outside sales oversight, the whole 9 yards. And it's different. The real estate part is all about relationship building and understanding what your customers need so you can beat the other guy. People don't know it, but building materials is a pretty competitive space. And a lot of it comes down to relationships, right? Like Home Depot and Lowe's. I was with Home Depot for 11 years too. They don't even
Mm.
remotely compete with home builders on anything. They
Yeah,
cannot do the business. They don't. They have like 3% market share, 2% market share. They're not even in the arena of being able
really.
to handle that type of business. So
Wow.
so the experience there really prepped me for what I did at Depot for 11 years. And that was when I got into multifamily, was when I was with Depot, is working on large national accounts for Home Depot and building client base of like 20 something $1 million a year
Hmm.
with mostly multifamily clients. And I had the largest commercial real estate portfolio at the Home Depot in the US while I was
Mm.
there. So the last 3 years I
Okay.
was there, I was on a plane like every 3 weeks,
Mm.
walking with customers. I had the third largest customer in the company, spending about $7 million a year just doing rehabs and turns and scheduling. And they were expanding like crazy. Family office, awesome, awesome company. Still talk to the guys. They're huge now, right? When I was
Hmm.
working with them, they were like 7,000 doors. Now they're closer to 20.
Oh,
So,
wow. Wow.
so it's
Yeah.
a different animal now than it was, but I helped them kind of put things in place to scale, and I learned what their priorities were, and they taught me about the language and the difference between the field and what the C-level wants to talk about and all of that stuff. So for me, like one thing kind of led to another, and that brought me into, joining a local real estate investors association. I did it when I had to, when I was the Home Depot guy, right? I was national account, so I would go to these nationally recognized chapters for the groups that Home Depot supported and met a lot of good people, learned a lot of stuff from the seminars and talks. And that's really kind of where I got my feet wet. I opened up I think I had my first equity trust account in 2011, maybe,
Mm.
to do, investing in real estate with IRAs and Roths and 401ks and all that other stuff. So it was very almost like I fell into it. There was nothing deliberate by any
Mm.
means.
Yeah.
So
Well, that is an interesting trajectory. Well, let's go into total cost of ownership. So, first of all, just define to us what it is that we're talking about when we talk about total cost of ownership.
sure. So total cost of ownership's been around for a long time. There's a bunch of different people who claim credit for creating it. Mostly starts showing up in the 80s. It was an IT term, and it basically encapsulates how much an asset costs you for the entire time you're going to own and use that asset. And it includes everything from the purchase price to delivery to maintenance and operations to the utilities that go into it to the labor and man hours to operate it to all of the expenses, unexpected and not, and then the cost of disposition, whether you're selling it, whether you're recycling it, whatever it is, and it can be applied to pretty much any product. Real estate, it's very hard to quantify because there's so many moving parts, and every building is its own microcosm. You can't just take a
Mhm.
whole portfolio and go, I'm going to do total cost of ownership on this whole thing. And I'll know exactly to the penny what this is going to cost. No, there's no way to do that because of the human element that's involved. You never know what is going to happen. So the goal that I kind of I didn't invent any of the things that I do when I look at total cost of ownership. I stole a bunch of really good ideas that were being implemented by my customers from 84 Lumber and Home Depot. And I looked at, well, what are these guys doing that works and why aren't they doing it? So when I was selling product, I was like, well, I can't sell you this because it's junk. Why don't you use this instead? This company's had a really good track record with using this guy or using this company, using this specific product. I can't get it, but they have really good luck with it. Here's their number, call them, talk to them about
Mhm.
it. And I would make those connections because it was helping me build the relationship and I would get other things from that. Now I take those good ideas, and when I walk into a family office or a large, multifamily operator, or even a small scattered site with 150 doors, it's okay. Well, who are you working with? What are you using? Why are you using it? And I'm asking a lot more questions, honestly, than I'm giving advice or answers because I need to understand where they are and where they're at and what their capability is, not just for change, but for making sure that whatever they choose to do is going to work for them. And it doesn't, not, there's never been two organizations I've walked into the door for that do everything exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And nobody's doing everything that they can to max out their net operating income. Like everybody thinks, oh, you're going to help me max out my net operating income. So what am I going to do? I'm going to turn some units and raise rents and maybe put, parking stickers on and charge tenants for that. Well, maybe that's some of it. Yeah, but no, the goal is to basically look at every decision you make from the top. So this is a strategy play. This is very much a C-level executive decision-making process, but you have to get the buy-in from the field. So how do you make that happen? It's all about, well, when I make this decision to use this insurance carrier, to hire these subcontractors, to use these products in this unit, what are all those things going to cost me throughout the time I'm going to own this asset, right? So if you're flipping and you're looking for a 2-year hold or a 5-year hold or a 3-month hold, if you really love capital gains, good for you. But the purchasing and the planning and the execution changes versus somebody who's going for a 10, 15, 20-year hold to cash flow, take depreciation, grow asset value. They're looking for a different set of answers. And the goal for me is to help them find those answers in a way that's going to work for them. Third-party property managers are not my client because it's too hard for them to change, and they don't have a financial incentive built into how they make their money to make any of those changes because it doesn't benefit them directly. In fact, it probably hurts them because if they're not an integrated owner operator, they're going to be reducing the amount of maintenance calls. They're going to be reducing the amount of repairs. They're going to be reducing the amount of CapEx. They're going to be planning ahead and having things put in place to have reserves. Like the days of being able to be like, oh, my roof is destroyed, my insurance isn't going to cover it, I'll just go get a note for 3% and I'm just going to finance that out and it'll be fine. Well, those days are over. You can't do that anymore. Cost of capital has more than doubled. So you need reserves again. You need to understand what the lifespan of products are inside your units. You need to understand the type of tenant that's going to live in those units and what the worst case scenario is going to be. Like you always build for failure. You always build for that lowest common denominator of tenant that is going to damage your stuff. In doing so, there's two things. One is your cost of ownership goes down over time because instead of just putting a Band-Aid on it and repairing it with junk that gets the job done temporarily and then you're replacing it again in a year or 2 years, you're back to spending the labor, you're back to spending the money for the materials. Now maybe that product's going to last 5 years or 7 years or 10 years, or maybe it lasts through more than one rehab. Like there's things out there you can buy that reduce your maintenance to essentially zero for the entire time you own that product and will last for 15 or 20 years. So yeah, you're going to pay more for it up front. But if you're looking for that long-term return, why wouldn't you, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes your budgets are wrong. Sometimes your planned out maintenance expenses, CapEx expenses are going to be wrong, and you need to adjust for it without just making a bunch of excuses. You need to own it. So, people using, perfect example, Pergo or laminate, whatever you want to call it, in their apartments. Okay, are your tenants really going to clean up a puddle within 7 minutes of spilling water on it every single time? Probably not. So why are you still using that product? That's a bad decision, and it's completely predictable and preventable. The advantage to that, the other side of this, is that when you start making those decisions, you're creating a better environment for your tenant. You're using better materials, you're using better products, better practices, and you're improving the quality of that unit by reducing its tendency for failure, right? You're building resilience into that unit. So in doing so, you're giving them something nicer than maybe they would have had down the street. Maybe they'll take better care of it because you're not just putting junk in there that is going to get destroyed and thrown away in 2 weeks.
So that makes perfectly good sense to me for building with quality. There, of course, is, like you had mentioned, there is the cost factor involved in that. And if you really are purchasing for the long term of 10 to 15 year hold periods or even longer than that, then it certainly makes sense to go with the quality products. if you're looking at a 5 to 7 year period, that equation is going to change. That doesn't mean you shouldn't look for quality, but I wonder how many operators actually do when their model is to hold and turn over within 5 to 7 years.
Not a lot do, unfortunately. Yeah. However, there are things that they can do where you get a 24 to 36 month ROI. And that's really where I focus most of the stuff is if it can't pay for itself within 36 months, nobody wants to hear about it.
Mm-hmm.
So if the difference between product A and product B, everything included isn't going to net them a benefit, then it's not even worth having a conversation because they're never going to use it. Like it's a different conversation between luxury class A and class C and D too, right? Because you want resilience, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the most expensive resilient product out there. It just needs to hold up better than like sheet vinyl and laminate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Enlightened investors, if you haven't done so already, be sure and click that like button and also click that share so others can take advantage of the content. And finally, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single one of our upcoming episodes. Well, how actually do you go into a team and work with the team to actually use total cost of ownership management?
So there's two different conversations that happen. One is the C-level conversation, and the other one is, or ownership, or whatever you want to call it, and the other one is the field. Mm-hmm. So the industry as a whole, construction as a whole, has been built and incentivized through payroll to do everything as cheap as possible, as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. And in the world of construction, they don't really care once that 12-month or 24-month warranty is up. Nothing is their problem. They don't care. You own it. It doesn't matter if it was, chewing gum holding your crown molding to your ceiling. They don't care. It's as long as it holds for that 2 years, they're good. They've met their obligations. Right. When you're looking at a apartment complex or even a single family rental, the math has to change a little bit because you don't know what is going to happen in those buildings at any time. So my advice usually to the C-level is you need to incentivize your people to do the right thing and not just the quick thing, because you set these budgets, you set these incentives and their bonuses and their payroll and coming in on time, under budget. If you're talking about maintenance, you're talking about, well, what's your time to repair? How long are those tickets open for? What's your actual expenditure? But you're not looking at all the things that pile into that, like cost of inventory on ground. If you don't have any inventory, it's zero. But if you have inventory, is your labor between windshield time savings and being able to purchase in bulk going to benefit you versus just ordering it on a website and waiting a couple days for stuff to come, or driving to a store and picking it up and bringing it? Because everybody I talk to is like, oh, I don't want my guys to actually be driving. I don't want windshield time. Windshield time is bad. And yet 3 guys on a property, if it's 300 units, right? One of those guys could be in a truck 20 or 30 hours a week. So what are you doing to stop that? And people aren't looking at everything, right? They're looking at, well, I just need this cheap thing from Lowe's and I'm going to fix it. Or I just need this from Home Depot, or I just need to put this Band-Aid on. And, deferred maintenance is one of the worst things you can ever do long-term, but that's a totally different conversation. Right. The end all be all is for the C-level. What are you doing to reduce your cost, reduce your labor, reduce your overhead? Those 3 tickets, those 3 buckets are your path to making a difference. You have to find a way to incentivize your people to stop focusing on just getting it done as fast as possible, using the cheapest stuff as possible, because your budgets are wrong. Like, budgets are great, but budgets only mean something when they're accurate and when you're able to hold your people accountable for them in a good way. Like, if your budget is unrealistic, if you're one of these people who's got a 50-year-old apartment complex and you're trying to run it at a 35%, you're out of your mind. It's never going to happen. And then you're going to penalize your people in the field because you can't hit those unrealistic numbers. So there has to be like a come to Jesus moment between leadership and field, where leadership doesn't win. Like, they can't have that conversation and have those controls, because if they're doing all this stuff to just put Band-Aids on it, and we see this with low-income housing all the time, because they're capped by fiat. They don't have a
Hmm.
choice in how they run those properties. So we see it there all the time that they just defer maintenance and defer maintenance and defer maintenance and band-aid, 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 band-aid. And they're not looking at the extra labor that they're spending because they're going back and doing the same thing 3 or 4 times where it could have been done once and been fixed for multiple years. They're not looking at the long-term snowball effect of making bad decisions. And so many operators are so in the business all the time that they can't step back and look at it from 10,000 feet and work on the business and their structure. Because of the way that snowball works, it just gets to a point where you're hemorrhaging money and you don't know how to stop. Because if you try to stop it, the year you do that, your books are going to look awful because your budgets are going to be blown, your payroll is going to be blown, your incentives and bonuses are going to be jacked. And that's where the incentive part comes in, is you have to find a way to reward these people long term for making the right decisions. And so every company I've worked with has found a different way to do it. Some of them don't do bonuses based on quickest repair time for their maintenance guys. Sometimes, they don't do bonuses to the property manager for coming in under budget on maintenance. They'll do reduction in total work calls. They'll do longevity of repair. Like if you can get this fixed, if there's callbacks, you lose parts of your bonus. Like you need to go in, fix it once, fix it right, have everything you need, no trips to the store. And that's your incentive, is to have the stuff done, because the ground level person doesn't care how much money you make as a company. The ground level person doesn't care about anything other than making sure they keep their job and put food on the table. If that means that they walk around for 40 hours a week, just in whatever on-call time they have, just putting out fires and putting band-aids on stuff, it keeps them busy. They think it's job security. You have to remove that connection by incentivizing them to do the right thing. Because as long as you've got people who are showing up hourly that are being incentivized to cut corners and do things the dumb way, the dumb things are going to happen. It's just like when you build your products in your units for your tenants. You build it for the lowest common denominator. Even if you're class B and class A properties, you always put the stuff in assuming the stupid is going to happen. And then when it does, it's not as bad or catastrophic as it could be.
Yes, the stupid is always going to happen. And if we don't plan for it, which we generally don't, it's always a surprise. And so it takes planning. So low maintenance calls is an incentive, longevity of repairs, reduction in drive time. Are there other incentives, or does that pretty well encapsulate it?
Usually there's something tied in. They'll find a way to control. So I always want them, as coming from the supply side, I always want to see some sort of procurement controls put in place. So there has to be, like, it doesn't have to be centralized purchasing. I think centralized purchasing is stupid because you lose contact with the field, and there's just all sorts of levels of disconnect that crop up as you start to add layers. You don't need to add a layer. What you need is somebody who's in charge of establishing the vendor relationships for the whole portfolio of properties. You need to have somebody who's working with them for national accounts to get discounts and rebates, to pool all the funds between all of the different properties, establish approved vendors, establish rebate and discount programs, establish all the things that can help the company be more profitable. Because typically I walk in and there's 15 to 20% of their material spend just laying on the table because they don't know what they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a ton of money generally for smaller operators, but when you're into the 10 and 20 and 30,000 doors, 20% is a lot of freaking money. It just is. And it's
Right.
just laying there because they don't know what they don't know. People
Mm-hmm.
just listen to what they're spoon fed. So you build product specifications so that you're building for that resilience, and you're making sure that you know what's going in the units. You're making sure that, the light fixture that these guys are putting in isn't going to disappear in 2 years. And then you've got 15 different light fixtures in 10 years being used on this
Mm-hmm.
property, and it's completely jacked up. Like, in my opinion, there's no reason for you to have to replace all of your lighting every time you rehab a property. There's just no reason for it, as long as it's, again, built for resiliency and kind of pre-planned around, is this
Mm-hmm.
still going to exist in 10 years? Like, it's one thing to change it because you want to keep up with the times and put modern, attractive stuff into a nicer unit and make sure that you're current and that the style is good. It's a whole nother conversation to just go and buy whatever's on the shelf for $5 and stick it up and cross your fingers. And that's a lot of what we see is, oh, well, this this integrated LED fixture doesn't exist anymore. We're just going to put something in that's on the shelf at Home Depot. And then by the time you're done, you don't know what units got what. You can't have parts in your shop because your shop inventory is now inflating, because instead of having one light fixture on the shelf, now you got 3 or 5 or 15. So again, it's that snowball thing. Like one bad decision leads to more bad decisions, leads to more. And then you've got this snowball of extra costs that are not going away. It's just getting bigger the further down the road you go. And I think we see a lot of that in some of these older properties from these more established operators who were, maybe it's family legacy, maybe it's family office, maybe it was, something that they did when they were younger and they just held it and now they're looking to sell. You go into them and they continuously and almost universally, unfortunately, seem to focus on the short-term gain and the long-term just goes down. Maybe it's because they're not trying to scale. Maybe it's because they're not empire building. Maybe it's because they just don't know what they don't know. But they're, generally speaking, some of the worst run properties out there, because even though they've been there, they've been profitable and whatever, so much stuff gets overlooked because, again, it's that in the business versus on the business. They're not shopping comps. They're not doing, any of the stuff that a growth focused newer, younger operator is doing. They're not making the mistakes the newer operators are making necessarily, but they're allowing that property to underperform without realizing it's underperforming.
Yeah, well, I think what you're talking here is a very sophisticated asset manager, and I'm thinking there's very few of those around.
That's very true. That's kind of where I come in and I help open the eyes and show them the stuff that they're leaving on the table and say, well, you're doing this. Here's what this is going to cost you over time versus doing something like this. And it always has to come down to the dollars and cents, at least at the C level. No change is going to happen without any type of financial incentive. So if it's not being mandated by fiat, by the government, by the competitive environment in that market, they're not going to do it because it's just extra. And change costs money, right? Any type of change to process, any type of change to vendors, any type of change to anything costs a certain amount, because there's training and onboarding time and rollout and just labor and attention to detail that wouldn't normally have to be spent, because things that are habits, things that are habitual, are a lot easier to do than trying to build that habit and having to focus and intention and drive it with intention.
Well, a lot to really think about and to consider here, from management style, from incentives, from really education of property managers. And I'm thinking of all of the training programs and everything I've seen out there in terms of multifamily, which there's billions of different training programs.
Yep.
I don't think I have seen any that are training asset managers to do what you're talking about. This is new information for me. And I can certainly see how critical it is. I can see that probably the better property managers out there probably have somewhat of an intuitive idea of what you're talking about, but very few, if any, have the in-depth understanding of the detail of the processes that you're talking about. The asset managers are looking at the overall aspect of it, and generally speaking, they're looking at 5 to 7 year holds. They're looking at rental income as opposed to gross expenses, but very, very few are drilling down to the detail of those expenses to really understand why those expenses are what they are. So tell us, Andy, about the services that you provide and how it is that apartment owners can take advantage of your services.
Absolutely. Thanks. So I do just what we've talked about. I help basically connect the issues in the field to the C level and explain it in a way that makes sense. Like you said, there's a lot of technical detail and a lot of granularity to what I do, but that's because I dealt with building materials and, having to deal with the complaints and the problems for failed products, honestly, and wanting to avoid those was half of my reason why I started selling based off of the value to the company, right? The overall highest and best value that everybody talks about, well, that was literally what I was going out and doing. Was I was presenting the products and the services that would pay back over time to make it easier to sell that product, especially when you're dealing with a company like Home Depot, where there's two types of people that like to buy from Home Depot. There's the people who like Home Depot and like to buy from Home Depot. And then there's the people who hate Home Depot, but have to buy from Home Depot because everybody buys from Home Depot, love them or hate them. There's no such thing as a cold call from a Home Depot. It's always a warm call because everybody and their brother, if they're in real estate or property management, buys something there eventually.
Mm-hmm.
It's just reality. So my job was to minimize the pain for my clients so that I could minimize my pain trying to fix the problems. So that sort of led into what I'm doing now. And it was actually a client of mine that now manages 20 something thousand doors, different company, but they called me. One of the VPs called me when he took over procurement and risk management. I wasn't even working at Home Depot anymore. And he's like, "Can you help me? Because I just took this over." And we had a, half-hour coffee turned into a 3.5-hour conversation. And at the end of it, he was like, "You should do this full time." Yeah, I probably should, actually, now that you say that. So I started doing this full time. But my ADHD gives me the ability to hyper focus and kind of learn and retain all those details about all the products and processes and issues. And if I find it useful or interesting, my brain holds on to it apparently forever, because I still have stuff up here from when I was like 10 and 12 that's completely relevant now, but it burned into my brain because at the time it was super, super relevant to what I was interested in. So as long as I stayed interested in real estate, my customers stand to benefit a lot. But the system I have, it's a framework, right? I call it the TCO method. It stands for total cost of ownership, like you mentioned. And it's a framework, consulting framework, that I fleshed out and built over the last, I guess I was building it 10 years ago, but honestly, the last 4 years since I left and opened my own business, I really focused on finding things that were relevant that I could bring to people where they could move the needle within 36 months and save money. So the best time to implement some sort of TCO project is when you're about to do a rehab, whether it's a CapEx, whether it's a complete turn reno process, whether you're in the process of doing maybe just updates, right? Instead of just doing a make ready where you're just paint and, lipstick on a pig, maybe it's something where you're going to do cabinets or a light refresh. There's things you can start putting in place, and it does increase, shop inventory for a little while, but you just turn through it, right? I mean, the average 300 unit complex that I've worked on, it takes about 2 years to get all of the units turned because of move outs and tenants. And like, nobody wants to go into a vacant apartment complex and just try to rehab the entire thing, because you're just hemorrhaging money. All of your expenses don't stop. So you got to have tenants in there, and it's just figuring out how to juggle them. But everything that I bring, it starts with your vendors and your vendor management and getting the rebates and discounts and figuring out how to buy smarter and build relationships so that when something like the pandemic happens, you're not sitting there not able to do work because you can't get product, because you don't have that relationship. You always went from door to door knocking and saying, "I want the cheapest stuff. I want the cheapest stuff. I want the cheapest stuff." And all these people are putting these quotes together and doing all this work for you. And then you always just buy the cheapest stuff. Well, those people are going to stop taking care of you because you're not giving them any money. Like, they have expenses. It's a relationship business. So they're going to take care of you. So the clients I worked with during the pandemic that made out the best were the ones who had those relationships. Like, trying to build that relationship in the middle of the pandemic when everybody's knocking at their door and being desperate, that is not the time to figure out you did it wrong for the last 10 years, right? That's actually the worst case scenario you could be in. So we start there, and then we sort of look at the operations. We look at the whole portfolio, or just a single complex, honestly. And usually it starts with one and then leads to the rest, because they want to see returns. They don't want to pay me to fix their whole portfolio and try to put this stuff in place if they haven't tried it first. So it usually starts with a smaller complex, or maybe it's, I'm working with a client right now that's got 143 doors under management, and it's scattered site, maybe 6 and less, maybe a couple 10s or 12s, but smaller. But he's looking to scale. He wants to get into commercial. So I'm helping him build all the stuff now for his team so that when he's ready, he can move and just go from, the units he owns and manages to a bigger bite of the pie, let's say, and have the stuff in place already and already have the relationships and already have the ability to scale because everything's already there. So we look at how they're doing things, why they're doing things a certain way, what their priorities are, and then what's the disposition plan. Like if your portfolio is you're going to turn 10 to 15% of your portfolio a year, okay, so which of those properties do you not even want to bother looking at because you know you're just going to get rid of it, right? Mm-hmm. And I always discourage people from doing any type of deferred maintenance, even though it spikes the numbers for a year. But if it's the right thing for their business, it's the right thing for their business. People sometimes are stuck in situations that don't work out the way I would like to see them work out, but it's not financially viable for them. And that's still their call, right? I'll give them the best advice I can, but if it comes right down to brass tacks, they're still responsible for the fate of their apartments. All I can do is advise and show them a better way and hope that, they pick up some of it.
So how do we get in touch with you?
So there's a bunch of different ways. I'm everywhere. Mostly LinkedIn is where I spend most of my time. I'm sort of active on Twitter sometimes. Don't try to message me on Instagram or any of those places because I won't see it. You can find me at my website at andymcquade.com. I've got 2 different business websites. ARM Procurement Advisors, which is, I think, armpurchasing.com, and the ARM Companies, which are both business entities that do similar things, but slightly differently. And then TCOmethod.com is the web, kind of the hub for my podcast. I have a book that I wrote that actually started all of this. I actually wrote the book and it's not published for a whole bunch of trademark reasons. And I'm still dealing with it. I got my trademark approved now. So this is the first podcast I've been on where I can say my trademark's been approved, just not for printed media, which is actually what I started this as for the book. So I got it for podcast and I got it for downloadable PDFs and digital media, but they didn't give it to me for actually published paperworks, which is hilarious because we submitted all the samples and it was anyway, yes, good times. So, I wrote the book because of something somebody at REIA said. It's like, well, I'm too small to pay you to do this stuff with me. And I can't really, what do you have? I was like, I should probably write a book. And I had to figure out what the name was going to be. And then I wrote the book, got the name, started the trademark process, started the podcast, and it kind of went from there. So they can find me anywhere. They can email me, Andy at andymcquade.com, Andy at armcompanies.com. Like Andy at one of my websites will get to me. I try to make it as simple as possible. There's just a lot of moving parts in social media and online presence from an SEO standpoint. So I just do what people tell me.
Well, Andy, it's been wonderful having you today. Very informative conversation. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Enlightened investors, thank you for being with us today. We are always delighted to have you with us. So please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe, and head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and a review. Until next time, live abundantly, and we'll see you in the next episode. Enlightened investors, wait, don't go just yet. I just want to remind you about our recently launched webinar that you will not want to miss. If you're at all curious and would like to learn more about how real estate investing can diversify your investment portfolio, alleviate the anxiety associated with Wall Street swings, leverage your 401ks and IRAs to substantially increase the return on your investment, and do all of this with turnkey, hands-off passive real estate investments, then you'll want to immediately go to stevetalker.com/webinar. In the webinar, we'll also address the common dubious investment schemes that you want to avoid. To access the webinar, go to stevetalker.com/webinar. I look forward to seeing you in the webinar.
Thank you for tuning in to Real Estate Investing Abundance, brought to you by Steve Talker Capital, a company working for passionate professionals like you to develop financial independence built on solid, passive real estate investments. As part of our efforts to make the world a better place, Steve Talker Capital contributes to activities and organizations committed to better understand the equine. These endeavors attempt to enhance the human treatment of horses worldwide. Steve Talker Capital, working for a world where all creatures, great and small, flourish abundantly. For resources to develop your financial independence, connect with us at stevetalker.com.